All right, folks. There's going to be two videos this week as we talk about film tax credits, and industrial policy. And in the first video, I'm just going to talk about economic impact studies in general, all right? And more or less as a sort of a general way of thinking about the arts, or in fact any other sector. And in the second video, I'll get specifically into film. And what I'm talking about with film also applies to some things like music recording and things like that in the commercial sector. All right, so that's where we're going here, and so I'm going to talk about economic impact studies. Okay, so a funny thing, all my degrees are in economics, and that's what my PhD is in. And before I started teaching all this arts management stuff, I just used to be in an ordinary department of economics, teaching, Econ 101 and all the various courses there. And when I came into doing arts management, arts policy, one of the things I first found was that, well, there was all this use of economic impact studies. The economic impact of the arts in Bloomington is such and such a number, or the economic impact of the arts in the United States is this even grander number, or the economic impact of the film industry in Georgia is whatever, right? The funny thing about this is that economists, and it takes one to know one, economists don't like economic impact studies. We think they are wrong conceptually. We don't think they're of much use at all. And in fact, we frequently mock them. And so it's good for you to know, as somebody who's going to be going into arts management, just what we think the problem is, because you don't want to get into taking these things for granted, and you don't want to get into spending a whole bunch of money on consultants to do an economic impact study for you when it's actually not much use. Okay, so that's why I'm going to talk about this here. I've loaded up just a little 2-pager of notes written by myself, very rough. And so, I mean, how often do I assign you just a 2-page article? But if you read my notes, you should get the gist of it as well. And in this video, I'm really just going to be talking you through my notes. Okay. So the notes come in 3 parts. The first part is, what is an economic impact study? If you were to ask me, well, define economic impact, I'd actually have a hard time, because when I see these studies, I think, okay, what do they think the term actually means? I can tell you how people calculate this number that they call economic impact, but that doesn't actually tell me what they think the number is telling me. All right? So if that sounds kind of weird. So how do you calculate economic impact? I can at least more or less say that. All right, pick a sector. All right, pick any old sector. And it could be, say, the nonprofit arts in Bloomington, Indiana. Okay, so that's going to include Buskirk Chumley Theater, Cardinal Stage, Bloomington Playwrights Project, Bloomington Symphony. Let's just add up all the nonprofit arts organizations in Bloomington. All right. And suppose I said, okay, how much money was spent there? And I'm going to add it up across all organizations. Well, that's actually pretty easy to calculate, because I can just go to each organization and say, what were your revenues from, what were your revenues? I can ask that. That's pretty simple. I'd probably want to include both donations and ticket revenue, because really they're kind of the same thing. They both amount to sort of selling the product. So suppose I added that all up across all these arts organizations, okay? And that gives me a number. Okay, it gives me a number. In the notes I say, suppose it's $67 million. I don't actually know what it is, but suppose it's $67 million. And I say, okay, well, there's a start. Right, I can add up how much money was spent on all these different arts organizations. So that's where I start. Now, that represents income for somebody, right? It is, because think about, well, where does that money go? Well, some of it is paid out in wages and salaries, right? So it's income for those people. If it's a nonprofit organization, none of it is held as profit. If I were doing a survey of the commercial industry, I'd also include profits. And also, nonprofit arts organizations buy stuff, right? If you're mounting a show, you have to rent space, you have to buy, stuff to make the sets and the costumes and all these sorts of things. You have to spend money, right? So if arts organizations take in a bunch of revenue and they spend some of it either on employment, wages and salaries, or on other inputs that they might buy at a hardware store or a paint store, then that represents income for other businesses, right? The paint store now gets a bit of money. And you know, the lumber store gets a bit of money. So it's income for them as well. Furthermore, suppose I work for one of these organizations. Suppose I work for Cardinal Stage and I earn my salary from them when I get my paycheck. Well, what do I do with my paycheck? Well, I go and spend some of it. Not all of it, some of it I might save, but I'm gonna, you know, spend it at the grocery store, at restaurants, just sort of anything I spend money on. And that creates more revenue for whatever grocery store I go to, whatever restaurants I go to. So you get all these sort of follow-on spending and follow-on revenues to other organizations. Now, I said that the first number was 67 million. The follow-on number, at least in the next round, won't be as high as that because at least some of the things that are purchased are going to be from outside of Bloomington. Okay, so it's not going to amount to sort of, you know, revenues in Bloomington. And also I'm going to save some. So it'll be some number smaller than 67 million, but it does generate more income for somebody else. But now they receive it and they go and spend it, right? So we get another round. Again, it'll be a smaller and smaller number as I go through successive rounds, but I have all these what are called indirect spending effects. Okay, now, suppose I add up that first number, 67 million is spent on the nonprofit arts in Bloomington, and then I add up all the subsequent rounds of spending that I think come from that. And there are consultants who have models, so-called input-output models, that actually try to measure what that spending might look like on different sectors. Suppose I add it all up, okay? Then I get some total. That total might be sort of a big number. In the notes I picked 167.5 million, which is 2.5 times the original spending. And that 2.5 number, I would call the spending multiplier. It's the, is what it says. It's the degree to which that initial spending is multiplied up to get the total spending. So we have the direct spending, we have the indirect spending, we add the total up, and they call that number economic impact. Okay, so that's how it's calculated, that's how it's done. What it actually means, again, that's not very clear. So in terms of trying to explain, you know, what does that number actually tell us, right? You know, what that 167.5 million, what does that actually tell us? Okay, well, maybe the best way to explain is to show you how it's used. So this is the second part of my notes, which is called What is Wrong with the Economics of Economic Impact Studies. So suppose the study says, well, actually, I use cranberry farming in my notes. So suppose we're talking about cranberry farming, the economic impact of cranberry farming. And suppose an advocate for the cranberry sector, okay, maybe it's the, you know, Cranberry Council or whatever, comes out and says, cranberries mean $167.5 million of income in our state. And if we were to lose our cranberry farms, that's how much income we would lose. Okay, now when I see economic impact studies, I think that's what they mean. Okay, that if the sector were to disappear, the economy would be that much poorer because we'd lose all that direct income and we'd lose all the follow-on indirect income as well. Okay, so if we were to lose that economic impact, we'd just be that much poorer. And generally it's in the context of, therefore, we have to support our cranberry farmers or whatever sector we're looking at. Now, an economist responds and says, well, hang on here. Suppose we did lose the cranberry sector. Okay, suppose a study came out that said, you know, cranberries are actually terrible for your health and nobody should eat them anymore. And suppose demand just collapsed and cranberry farms just went right out of business. Suppose it actually happened. I don't think it's going to happen, but suppose it did. What would happen next? Well, think about the land that the cranberries were farmed on. It could be used for something else, right? It might be used to grow another crop, might be used in residential or commercial development. It'd be put to use doing something, right? And the people who worked growing cranberries, okay, the farmers and the farm hands, they'd find a job doing something else. They might keep a job on a farm, but it'd be a farm growing a different thing. They might move into a different sector that is growing, but they'd get a job someplace. And so it's not exactly true that all of that income would disappear, because the land and the people who were working it would get jobs doing other things. Furthermore, we know that the money that people spent on cranberries, they'd spend on something else, right? It's not that it would disappear. So if people are spending less at the grocery store on cranberries, well, they're either buying more other groceries, they're buying more other stuff, but something, it would go somewhere. So the spending wouldn't disappear, it would just be spent on a different thing. And the jobs and land use wouldn't disappear, they would just be devoted to a different thing. So industries in the economy are always rising and falling, and people are always shifting between sectors. Okay, there's been huge shifts in terms of what kinds of jobs people do. Some sectors go into decline, other ones really increase. Some jobs disappear altogether that were in fact once employed thousands. Okay, at the time of the Second World War, tens of thousands of people were employed as telephone operators. But when was the last time you used a telephone operator to make a long distance call, right? So, jobs changed. And so it's not as if that economic impact would disappear. And so the claim that, if cranberries disappear, we lose all that income, we actually don't. Okay, we actually don't, because it just means that the money is spent elsewhere. Okay, so this is a problem economists have with these studies that gives them misleading interpretation. So let me give you an arts example. So suppose a city planner comes out and says, well, we're looking at spending $3 million to build a new performing arts center. And the planner says, this is really great because we'll spend $3 million on construction costs to build this, which is a lot of income for people. And with the multiplier, because of all the indirect spending, the people who earn money working in construction are going to spend money on other stuff. The total impact would be $7.5 million. So isn't that great? Shouldn't we do that? Here's the problem with this. Essentially, as an economist, I'd go back and say, well, that $3 million you're thinking of spending on a performing arts center, you could actually do a lot of things with. You could spend it repairing infrastructure. Okay, maybe your sewage and water treatment plant is getting really out of date and really needs fixing up. You could spend it on that. You could spend it on programs. You could spend it on new after-school programs, if that's something you really need, or new public health programs. Or you could actually not spend it at all, and you could just reduce people's taxes by $3 million. And then they would personally have more money that they could spend on stuff. So it's not an argument for building the Performing Arts Center, because spending the money on anything, whether the government does it or if you leave it in taxpayers' pockets so they spend it, any of those things will generate income, and any of those things will generate indirect spending. So it's actually not an argument at all, right? It doesn't justify it at all. If I did want to use economics to justify a new Performing Arts Center, what I would say is, okay, here's a cost-benefit study, and cost-benefit analysis is good economics. That's why we teach it in SPIA. You'll notice in the SPIA course list, we have courses in cost-benefit analysis, but we do not have courses in economic impact studies, do we? Cost-benefit analysis just says, what would be the benefit of the Performing Arts Center to people who use it? People who would pay money to go to shows, right? That's the benefit of having a Performing Arts Center, is you can go see stuff. The cost is the cost of building it and running it. The cost of building it is the cost. That's not the benefit of the thing, that's the cost of the thing. You compare the benefits to the cost. If the benefits are bigger, then you do it. That's how you analyze building a new Performing Arts Center. But people use these economic impact studies. You can use it to justify anything because you can say, well, it's spending money, isn't it? And the indirect effects, aren't there? So people who always say, yeah, we need a new sports stadium. Football teams who say we need a new stadium every 10 years. They try to use these arguments, but they don't really hold up. So the economics is bad. Okay, the economics of economic impact studies is bad. Third part of my notes. What's wrong with the politics of economic impact studies? So here I get into the question of how they are used in arts advocacy to try to get politicians to say, oh yes, we should support the arts. Okay, what's wrong with using economic impact studies for that? Well, I list 4 problems. Okay, first problem is that there has never been any evidence that I've seen, and I've studied this for many, many, many years. There's never been any evidence I've seen that politicians could care less about an economic impact study, right? It doesn't induce them to spend more. We are awash in economic impact studies, and if they actually worked, the arts sector would be hugely well funded, but it isn't, because it doesn't actually persuade anybody. It doesn't actually, carry any weight. Don't forget that all the stuff I said about the problems with economic impact studies, every economist working in the Treasury Department and government knows that, okay? They know these studies aren't very good. So it doesn't really persuade anybody. It doesn't do anything. Second problem with economic impact studies is they don't actually give you any policy guidance. So in the notes, I say, suppose you found that the economic impact of the nonprofit arts in Bloomington was $73 million a year. Suppose that was the number you came up with. What does that actually tell the government to do? Does it say we should increase funding in the arts? Or decrease it? Or that it's just right? Is it a big number? 73 million, kind of what you'd expect? Or is that very big? Or in fact, is it actually very small? Okay, I actually don't know. Does it tell you, well, this lets us know that we should actually increase spending on program X, decrease it on program Y? No, it doesn't tell you that. It doesn't tell you to do anything. Okay, the economic impact study does not give any guidance for decision-making for any question a policymaker could possibly ask. There's no question a policymaker could ask where the answer would involve, here's the economic impact number. It doesn't give you anything. Here's a way to see that. I've just been using the example, the economic impact of the nonprofit arts in Bloomington is estimated to be 73 million a year. Suppose I then came forward and said, oh man, I made a typo. I meant to say 63 million a year, not 73 million. Would it make any difference to anything, any policy decision? No, no, it wouldn't, right? Okay, it doesn't get you anything. Third problem with the politics of economic impact studies is that it involves an opportunity cost, okay? So if you are trying to advocate for more government spending, every minute that you spend trying to push economic impact, every media notice you put out that tries to stress economic impact is a lost opportunity to promote something else, a different message, okay? So any message you're trying to give is using up attention space, and that means you have less space for anything else. We're in the middle of an election, right? You're seeing election ads all over the place. Any political manager will tell you this. Anything you try to push as part of your campaign means you're having to downplay something else, okay? Any issue you want to highlight, you've got less time to highlight the other stuff. You have to pick and choose what you're really going to push. If you pick economic impact studies, you're choosing something that's not very useful, and you're taking away your opportunity to give a different message because you're using up all that space. So what are the problems with the politics of economic impact studies? 1, nobody seems to listen to them. 2, they don't give you any policy guidance. 3, they're taking up valuable space that you could be using to promote other messages. 1 more problem, okay, last one. The whole idea of advocating for the arts is that you're trying to say the arts are special, okay? If I said, well, why don't we have a policy for giving grants to makers of maroon colored ties like I'm wearing right now? You'd say, well, Why would we? I mean, what's the big deal about maroon colored ties? We don't need a policy for that. We don't need to subsidize that. Normally your response would be, yeah, but the arts are different. Okay, the arts are different. And they do warrant something. And there's different arguments you could pick. In fact, we've done a bunch of them, right? We could go back to our economics lectures in about week 4, week 5, and we could say, yeah, there's actually big externalities from the arts, and you want to subsidize things with externalities. We could be communitarians like Charles Taylor, and we could say it's important that we sustain the culture that in fact gives us our identities and our ways of thinking. We could be like the liberal theorist Ronald Dworkin and say, you know, if we're really concerned about equality, we have to think about intergenerational equality, and that means we have an obligation to pass on to future generations a vibrant cultural palette. Okay, there's all kinds of arguments we can give for why the arts are special. If you use an economic impact study, you're using the same thing that cranberry growers use, that stock car racing uses, that petrochemical production uses. You are making it just like any other ordinary sector. I could do an economic impact study of the production of maroon colored ties, and you're reducing the arts down to that level. But that's exactly what you don't want to do. The last thing you want to do is say the arts are just like any other sector. They're just an ordinary sector that generates jobs and incomes, just like all the others, because it's true, the arts do generate jobs and incomes. I mean, that's very true. But that's not why you'd want to have public policy supporting. That's not a reason to do it. Okay? So it doesn't give you anything. So they're not good economically. No economist takes them seriously. But they're not actually good as an advocacy tool either. Okay? Don't use economic impact studies. Friends don't let friends use economic impact studies. So in the second video, I'm going to talk about how this applies to the movie making business.